My name is Christine, and I'm 32 years old. For the past 7 years, I've worked as a federal auditor for the IRS, the kind of job that teaches you to notice when numbers don't add up, when stories have gaps, and when people are hiding something they don't want you to find. I'm not dramatic by nature. I don't jump to conclusions. I follow the evidence, I document everything, and I wait. Those habits have served me well in my career. I never thought I'd have to use them on my own family. 3 months ago, my grandmother passed away. Eleanor May Whitfield was 81 years old, sharp as a tack until the very end, and she loved every single one of her grandchildren. But she was never blind about who we were. She saw us clearly. That was the thing about her. She didn't pretend. She left behind a farmhouse in rural Virginia, a modest investment portfolio, and a life insurance policy that, combined, totaled just over $1.8 million. She had updated her will 6 months before she died, and she told me herself, over the phone on a Tuesday evening while I was eating leftover pasta at my kitchen counter, that she had made her decisions carefully and that she was at peace with them. "I've taken care of you, Christine," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. I do now. The will reading was scheduled for a Saturday morning at the office of my grandmother's attorney, a man named Gerald Holt who had handled her affairs for over 20 years. The gathering was small, just family. My mother, my Aunt Patricia, my cousin Derek, who is Patricia's son, and me. Derek's wife, Samantha, also came, though she hadn't been invited. She said she was there for moral support. She sat in the corner with her arms crossed and her eyes moving around the room like she was taking inventory. I had always found Samantha difficult to read. She was pleasant enough on the surface, the kind of woman who remembered your birthday and brought the right wine to dinner parties and laughed at exactly the right moments. But there was always something calculated about her pleasantness, like it was a tool she kept sharpened. Gerald Holt read the will quietly and methodically. My grandmother had divided her estate thoughtfully. The farmhouse went to my mother, who had always loved it and spent summers there as a child. A portion of the investment portfolio was split between my aunt and a local historical preservation society my grandmother had supported for decades. And the life insurance policy, $1.1 million, was designated entirely to me. The room was very quiet when Gerald read that part. I didn't look at Samantha, but I felt her looking at me. My mother squeezed my hand. My aunt nodded slowly, like she had expected it. Gerald continued reading without pause, professional and unhurried, and the meeting concluded within the hour. We signed what needed to be signed. Gerald's assistant brought in coffee and a small tray of cookies that nobody touched. Afterward, my aunt suggested we all go to lunch together. Eleanor would have wanted that, she said, and she was right, so we agreed. We chose a restaurant about 15 minutes away, an upscale American place called the Birchwood that my grandmother had loved for its quiet booths and good bread. We drove separately. I rode with my mother. In the car, my mother was uncharacteristically quiet. She kept her eyes on the road and her hands steady on the wheel, but I could see something working behind her expression. "What is it?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. Then, after a pause, "Watch yourself today, Christine. Just watch yourself." "Mom, I'm not saying anything. I just know how people get when money is involved." She glanced at me briefly. "Even people we love." I let it sit. I didn't push her. I had learned over the years that my mother communicated in warnings and silences, and that it was better to pay attention than to demand elaboration. The Birchwood was elegant and calm, the kind of place where the noise level never rises above a comfortable murmur. We were seated at a large round table near the window. A bread basket arrived immediately. The server introduced herself and took our drink orders: water for me, wine for the others. Samantha ordered a sparkling water and then almost immediately excused herself to take a phone call, stepping away from the table with her phone pressed to her ear and her back turned to us. I watched her go. I watched her pause near the hostess stand, glance back at our table, and then turn away again. Our drinks arrived. The server set mine down in front of my empty chair. I had stepped briefly to the restroom moments before, and then distributed the rest. My mother poured herself a glass of water. My aunt was telling a story about my grandmother that made everyone smile. When I returned to the table, I noticed something before I sat down. It was small. It might have meant nothing. Samantha was back in her seat, and she had positioned herself one chair closer to mine than she had been before, close enough that our chairs were nearly touching. She was talking to Derek, turned slightly away from me. Her right hand was in her lap, below the table. I am a federal auditor. I notice details for a living. I didn't sit down immediately. I paused behind my chair, adjusted my jacket, and let my eyes move across the table in a way that looked casual. The sparkling water glass in front of Samantha's original seat, the water glass in front of mine, the very faint disturbance in the ice, the way the surface of the liquid was slightly unsettled, as if something had been introduced to it recently. I pulled out my chair and sat down. I did not touch my glass. I picked up a piece of bread instead, and joined the conversation as if nothing had happened. My voice was steady. My hands were steady. 7 years of interviewing people under audit conditions will teach you how to keep your face neutral when your heart is doing something else entirely. Inside, I was running through everything. What I had seen, what it meant, what I needed to do next. I excused myself again about 10 minutes later, telling the table I needed to make a quick work call. I stepped into the hallway near the restrooms, pulled out my phone, and stood still for a moment, thinking. Then I went back to the table. I sat down. I watched Samantha. She was good. She was attentive and warm, and she laughed when she was supposed to laugh, and she asked my mother questions about the farmhouse in a way that sounded genuinely interested. She touched Derek's arm at regular intervals, the way people do when they want to look connected and unconcerned, but I caught it the moment when she glanced at my glass. It was less than a second. A flicker. The kind of look someone gives a door they've locked and want to make sure is still locked. I excused myself one more time. This time, I went to find the restaurant manager. His name was a Mr. Ellison, a composed man in his early 50s who listened to me without interrupting. I told him only what I needed to tell him, that I had reason to believe something may have been added to my drink, and that I would appreciate 2 things. Someone to discreetly remove the glass and preserve it without disturbing the table, and a quiet word with whoever had been near that side of the room in the last 20 minutes. He looked at me for a moment. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain enough to ask," I said. He nodded once and reached for his radio. I returned to the table. The conversation had moved on to summer plans. I smiled and listened and ate my bread and waited. 14 minutes later, as we were looking at menus, a young woman in a restaurant uniform approached me from my left. She leaned down quietly and said, "Excuse me, ma'am. The manager would like a word when you have a moment." I set down my menu, of course. I excused myself with a small smile. In the hallway, Mr. Ellison was waiting with one of his staff members, a young man who turned out to be a server in training who had been working the section adjacent to ours. His name was Will, and he looked slightly nervous but steady. "Tell her what you told me," Mr. Ellison said. Will looked at me. I was bringing a tray from the service corridor about maybe 15-20 minutes ago. The corridor runs along the back wall, and there's a gap where you can see into the dining room from an angle most guests don't notice. He paused. "I saw the woman sitting next to your seat. She was leaning toward your glass. She had something in her hand like a small packet, folded up. She looked around first. She didn't see me. She unfolded it, and I didn't understand what I was seeing at first, so I kept watching. She tipped something into your water, then she sat back and put her hands in her lap and started talking to the man next to her like nothing happened. The hallway was very quiet. Did you see what was in the packet?" I asked. "No, ma'am. It was small, like a folded piece of paper or a thin envelope." I thanked him. I thanked Mr. Ellison. I asked him to preserve the glass and keep Will available in case I needed him to speak to anyone else. Then I stood in that hallway for approximately 30 seconds and did nothing but breathe. Then I went back to the table. I sat down. I smiled. I asked my aunt to tell me more about the Historical Preservation Society my grandmother had donated to, because I had always been curious about it. My aunt lit up and began talking, and the table relaxed, and Samantha watched me from across the breadbasket with an expression of pleasant composure. She had no idea. That evening, I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I pulled up every document I had signed that morning at Gerald Holt's office. I read through every page. On page 7 of the estate transfer documentation, a supplementary form I had been told was standard administrative procedure, I found a clause I had not seen in my initial read-through. A clause that, if signed and processed, would redirect a significant portion of the designated insurance benefit into a joint family account, ostensibly to cover shared estate administrative costs, an account that, when I traced the account number through the documentation, was in the name of Derek and Samantha. I stared at that page for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Gerald Holt's emergency line. He answered on the third ring. I told him what I had found. He was quiet for a moment and then said he needed to pull his own copies. 15 minutes later, he called me back and his voice had changed. "Christine," he said carefully, "the version of that document I have in my files does not contain that clause." "Someone swapped a page," I said. "That would appear to be the case. When was the last time that file was accessed before today?" A pause. "I'll need to check with my assistant. We had an inquiry earlier this week. Someone called asking about the documentation requirements and whether supplementary forms could be brought to the reading for efficiency purposes. The call came from a number I don't recognize." I wrote everything down. I photographed every page of my copies. I sent Gerald a secure email with the images attached before I went to bed that night, because I did not want those documents out of my control for a single additional hour. I slept badly. But I slept. The next 3 days were the quietest 3 days of my life. I went to work. I answered emails. I had lunch with a colleague and talked about nothing in particular. I did not call Derek. I did not call Samantha. I did not say a word to anyone outside of Gerald Holt, and, on the second day, a forensic document specialist I contacted through a professional connection who agreed to examine the altered page. The specialist confirmed it within 48 hours. The paper stock of page 7 was slightly different from the rest of the document. The font was a near-perfect match, but off by a fraction of a point, the kind of thing you would only catch if you were looking for it or if you had equipment that looked for it. The document had been printed separately and inserted. On the third day, I received a preliminary report from the lab that the restaurant had engaged to test the contents of my preserved water glass. They found a measurable quantity of a sedative compound, not enough to be immediately dangerous to a healthy adult, but enough to cause significant disorientation, confusion, and impaired judgment lasting several hours. I read that report sitting at my desk at work. I read it twice. Then I picked up my phone and called Derek. "Hey," he said, easy and warm the way he always was. "How are you holding up?" "It's been a rough week." "I'm okay," I said. "I was actually wondering if you and Samantha could come over Saturday. There are a few things from Grandma Eleanor's estate I wanted to go through with you. Some personal items. I think she would have wanted the family to have a say." "Of course," he said immediately. "Of course we'll be there. What time?" 2 o'clock, I said. "I'll make coffee." Saturday afternoon was gray and cool, the kind of October day that makes the light look old. Derek and Samantha arrived 8 minutes early. Samantha was carrying a small plant as a gift, which I accepted and set on the counter. We sat at my dining room table. I had made coffee, as promised. I had also placed 3 folders on the table, face down. I let the conversation run for a few minutes. Small talk about the drive, about the weather, about Derek's work. Samantha was her usual composed self. She had brought the plant. She asked how I was sleeping. "Not great," I said honestly. "A lot on my mind." "Completely understandable," she said. "Grief does that." "It does," I agreed. "So does discovering that someone tried to drug you." The room shifted. It was the silence that happened in a fraction of a second, the kind that lands like a hand on a table. Derek's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling, uncertainly, on confusion. Samantha's face did not change at all. That told me what I needed to know about who had been the architect of this. I turned over the first folder. Inside was the lab report from the restaurant, with the compound clearly identified and the glass documented as having been collected from my place setting. "The restaurant preserved the glass," I said. "It was tested." I turned over the second folder. Inside was the forensic document specialist's report, with photographs of the page and the analysis of the paper stock and the font discrepancy. "Page 7, I said. The specialist confirmed it was printed separately and inserted into the document I signed. I turned over the third folder. Inside was a printed record of a phone call made from Samantha's cell number to Gerald Holt's office 3 days before the will reading, requesting information about supplementary estate documentation. The silence in the room was complete. Derek was looking at Samantha. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a person they are suddenly not sure they recognize. His face had gone pale and very still. Samantha looked at the folders. Then she looked at me. And for just a moment, the pleasantness slipped, not entirely, but enough. Enough for me to see what was underneath it. I want to be clear about something, I said. My voice was even. This is the voice I use in audit interviews. The voice that does not rise or waver. I'm not doing this to cause a scene. I'm not doing this to destroy anyone's life. I'm doing this because my grandmother trusted me, and someone tried to take that, and someone tried to make sure I couldn't think clearly enough to notice. Samantha said nothing. The evidence is already with Gerald Holt, I continued. The lab report, the document analysis, the phone record. He's retained copies. My attorney has copies. And I have copies. I folded my hands on the table. The clause on page 7 has been voided. Gerald confirmed that the executed document in his records, the legitimate one, is controlling. The account it references has been flagged. Derek made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I'm not going to the police today, I said. I'm not going to the police this week. But I want Samantha to understand something very clearly. I looked at her directly. I keep records. I keep everything. If anything happens to me, to my mother, to anyone in this family, those records go to law enforcement within 24 hours. All of them. Every document, every report, every phone record. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Samantha looked at me for a long moment. Her hands were in her lap. Her face had returned to its usual composure, but it was thinner now, like a mask worn over something that no longer fit quite right. Yes, she said quietly. Good. Derek pushed back his chair and stood up. He looked at the folders and then looked at his wife, and then looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, a kind of gutted, unmoored grief. I almost felt sorry for him. I think part of me did. I didn't know, he said. I believed him. I had been watching him for the past 20 minutes, and I believed him. I know, I said. They left. I stood at my window and watched their car back out of the driveway and move down the street until it disappeared around the corner. The gray October light sat still and quiet over the yard. I thought about my grandmother, about that Tuesday phone call, about the sound of her voice when she said she had taken care of me. I thought about how she had updated her will 6 months before she died, as if she had known, not specifically, maybe, but in the way that clear-eyed people sometimes know that not everyone in the room would be happy with her decisions. She saw us clearly. That was the thing about her. I washed the coffee cups. I put the folders back in the drawer where I kept important documents. I fed the small plant Samantha had brought, setting it on the windowsill where it would get morning light, because the plant had done nothing wrong. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and I let myself feel it, all of it, the grief that had been waiting patiently behind 7 days of documentation and strategy and steadiness. I let myself grieve my grandmother. I let myself be 32 years old and tired and sad and angry, in that order. And then I dried my eyes, opened my laptop, and started drafting the letter to Gerald Holt, confirming the estate transfer. My grandmother had taken care of me. The least I could do was take care of what she left behind.